It was a bright Saturday afternoon at the park, the kind of day that made you forget about your worries for a while. Families were out, kids were running around laughing, and the gentle hum of conversations filled the air. A man in his early 30s strolled along the walking path, hand in hand with a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. Her small fingers were wrapped around his, and every now and then, she'd skip a little ahead, giggling at something funny she saw. The bond between them was clear, the way he smiled at her, the way she looked up at him with trust in her eyes. To any passerby, they looked like a father and daughter enjoying a simple, beautiful day. But not everyone saw it that way. A woman sitting on a nearby park bench noticed them. At first, her eyes followed them casually, but soon her expression shifted. She frowned slightly, watching the man and the little girl more intently. Her mind started racing with questions. Why was this black man walking with a white child? She watched as they moved closer to the swings, where the man helped the little girl up, giving her a gentle push. The girl's laughter filled the air, but the woman couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside her. She glanced around, as if looking for someone who might confirm her suspicions, but no one else seemed concerned. Parents nearby were lost in their own worlds, chatting with each other, or playing with their own kids. But she couldn't let it go. Something wasn't right, and with each passing minute, her worry turned into fear, a fear that quickly began to spiral out of control. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked it and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, but the woman's voice was far from it. There's a black man here at the park, she started, her voice tight with tension. And he's with this little white girl. She doesn't look like she belongs to him. I'm worried something's wrong. The operator asked for more details, but the woman barely heard the questions. Her mind was already racing with worst-case scenarios. She was convinced she was doing the right thing, that she was helping protect a child who might be in danger. Meanwhile, the man had no idea what was happening. He was too busy pushing his daughter on the swing. Her laughter and joy, the only things that mattered to him in that moment. He didn't notice the sideways glances from the woman or the quiet conversations that were starting to ripple through the park as more people began to notice commotion. A few minutes later, the sound of police sirens shattered the peaceful atmosphere. People started looking around, curious and confused. The man, still oblivious, was kneeling down to tie his daughter's shoe when he saw 2 police officers approaching him. His heart sank. What was going on? The officers walked up to him, their faces serious, and asked him to step aside for a moment. The little girl clung to his leg, her wide eyes filled with confusion. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice small and frightened. "Everything's okay, sweetheart," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. But inside, he was anything but calm. His mind was racing, trying to figure out why the police were there, why they were looking at him like he had done something wrong. "We received a report," one of the officers began, his tone professional but firm. "A woman called, concerned about the child you're with. Can you tell us what's going on?" The man's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what was happening. Someone had seen him with his daughter and assumed the worst. His stomach twisted with anger and frustration, but more than anything, he felt a deep sense of dread. The woman who had made the call was standing off to the side now, watching the scene unfold with a look of self-satisfaction on her face, convinced she had done the right thing. But she had no idea what was about to happen next, what her actions had set in motion. The officers looked from the man to little girl, then back again, waiting for him to explain. But before he could get a word out, the little girl spoke up. "This is my daddy," she said, her voice shaking slightly but full of innocence. "Why are you talking to him like he did something bad?" The officers exchanged a quick glance, and for a moment, there was a flicker of doubt in their eyes. But the situation was far from over. They still had questions. They still needed proof. And what happens next? Well, Let's just say no one saw it coming. Not the woman who made the call, not the police officers, and certainly not the man who just wanted to spend a sunny afternoon with his daughter. Stay tuned, because the next part of this story is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. The officers paused for a moment, hearing the little girl's words, but their posture didn't relax. They still had to investigate. The man could feel the tension rising around him, a tension that was thick and heavy. He knew that no matter how innocent the situation, being a black man in this moment meant everything could go wrong in the blink of an eye. He carefully stood up, making sure his movements were slow and deliberate, not wanting to give the police any reason to escalate things. His mind raced as he searched for the right words to explain the situation. He'd been through enough in life to know that one wrong word, one wrong move, could make things spiral out of control. "I'm her father," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the situation. He glanced down at his daughter, who was still clinging to his leg, her small hands gripping him tighter. "We're just here to enjoy park, that's all." One of the officers nodded slightly, but the other kept his hand near his belt, eyes still studying the man as though looking for a crack in his story. "Do you have any identification with you?" the officer asked, his voice flat but commanding. The man swallowed hard. He knew this was the part where things could get tricky. He did have his wallet in his pocket, but reaching for it could be misinterpreted. He'd seen enough stories in news to know that sometimes even a harmless gesture could turn deadly. He didn't want to be another headline. "Yeah, it's in my back pocket," he said slowly, holding his hands up slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm just going to reach for it, okay?" The officers nodded, but they didn't relax, and their hands didn't move away from their belts. The man carefully reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, his heart pounding as he handed over his ID. The officers looked at his ID for what felt like an eternity. The man's mind flashed back to earlier that day, the simple routine of getting his daughter ready for their park outing. He had braided her hair, just like she'd asked him to, and packed her favorite snacks in a little backpack. It had been a perfect morning, full of laughter and playfulness, with no idea that it would end like this, surrounded by police, being questioned for simply being with his own child. As the officers continued their scrutiny, the little girl tugged at her father's shirt, her big eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Daddy, why are they being mean to you?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. The question pierced through him, cutting deeper than any accusation the officers could throw his way. He bent down and gently stroked her hair, doing his best to reassure her, even though he himself was filled with uncertainty. "It's okay, sweetie," he whispered. "We're going to be okay." But as much as he tried to keep her calm, the reality of the situation hung over them both. People in the park were now watching more closely. Some had taken out their phones, recording the scene, and the air was thick with unspoken judgment. He could see the whispers, the sideways glances, the uncomfortable looks from strangers who had no idea what was really going on, but were quick to assume the worst. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the woman who had called the police still standing nearby. She was talking to another bystander, her voice loud enough to carry over to where he stood. "I knew something was off," she was saying, as if trying to justify her actions. "I just couldn't sit by and do nothing. You never know these days. It's better to be safe than sorry, right?" Her words sent a chill through him. The casual way she spoke, the ease with which she had decided to involve the police in something she didn't understand, it was infuriating. She had no idea of the danger she had put him in, all because she couldn't imagine that a black man could be the father of a white child. The officers, still holding his ID, exchanged another glance. One of them stepped away, radioing in the man's information, while the other stayed in place, his eyes never leaving the man's face. The man could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him even more. He had no criminal record, no reason to be afraid of what might come back when they checked his ID, but that didn't matter right now. In moments like this, Innocence wasn't always enough. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken bias that hung over the whole interaction. Meanwhile, the little girl looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with a trust that made his heart ache. She didn't understand why her father was being treated like this. To her, he was just her daddy, the one who made her breakfast every morning, tucked her in at night, and chased away her bad dreams. The one who loved her more than anything in the world. But the world outside of their home didn't always see things that way. The officer returned after a few minutes, and the silence that followed was deafening. For a brief moment, the man thought they might be ready to leave him alone, to let him and his daughter go back to enjoying their day at park. But instead, the officer looked at him, his expression still unreadable, and said, "We're going to need to ask you a few more questions." The man felt a surge of frustration. He had done nothing wrong. He had given them his ID, cooperated fully, and yet they still didn't believe him. The woman who had caused all of this was now standing even closer, arms crossed, a self-satisfied look on her face. She seemed to think she had done the right thing, that her suspicions had somehow been justified. But as the questions continued, the man's patience began to wear thin. The officers wanted to know everything: where he had been earlier that day, how long he had been at the park, if he had any proof that the girl was really his daughter. It was humiliating, infuriating, and heartbreaking all at once. The little girl, sensing her father's frustration, clung to him tighter. She didn't understand the full scope of what was happening, but she knew enough to feel the tension in the air. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man knelt down again, his voice gentle despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "I know, baby," he said softly, "but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of his control. What if this escalated even further? What if the officers decided they didn't believe him? He had seen too many stories of situations like this ending in disaster, and the fear of what could happen next was gnawing at him. And then, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, another car pulled up. This time, it wasn't a police car. It was a sleek black sedan, and when the door opened, a woman stepped out. The man's eyes widened in shock. It was her, the little girl's mother, his ex-wife, and the look on her face told him that whatever happened next was about to change everything. The officers turned to her, their expressions shifting slightly as they realized she might have answers. But she didn't say a word right away. Instead, she walked straight toward her daughter, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. And the man knew, in that moment, that whatever fragile balance he had managed to maintain was about to come crashing down. Because now with her there, the truth would come out. But whose truth? As the woman approached, the tension in the air grew thicker. The man stood frozen, his heart racing as he watched her kneel down in front of their daughter. She wrapped her arms around the little girl, pulling her close. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. The girl seemed to melt into her mother's embrace, the fear in her eyes replaced by comfort. The man couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, mixed with confusion. He had always tried to keep things amicable between them for their daughter's sake, but this moment felt like a complete betrayal. The woman stood back up, straightening her posture as she turned to face the officers. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her tone sharp and authoritative. The surprise on her face was evident, but there was also a hint of anger. "Why are you harassing my ex-husband?" The man could see the officers exchange wary glances. The woman's presence had changed the dynamic entirely. They seemed to regard her as a credible witness, someone who could potentially back up their claims, or worse, challenge his version of events. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, as if she were assessing him, judging him. "We received a call about a potential abduction," one of the officers finally replied, his voice calm but firm. We're just following protocol." "Abduction? You think he would kidnap our daughter?" Her voice was a mix of disbelief and anger, and the man could see the wheels turning in her mind. She looked at him, eyes narrowed, and he could sense the underlying accusation. It was as if she was searching for evidence that he was somehow capable of such a thing. He could feel her disappointment, like a physical blow. "No, that's not what I meant," he said, struggling to regain his footing in the conversation. "I'm her father. We were just enjoying the park." But as the words left his mouth, he felt them sound hollow, as if they lacked the conviction they needed to pierce through the growing tension. "I don't understand why you didn't tell me you were coming here," she replied, her tone a mixture of confusion and accusation. "Why would you bring her here without letting me know?" The man could feel the heat rising in his cheeks. "I didn't think it was necessary," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just wanted to spend some time with her." The officers were listening intently, but the tension was palpable. They could feel the family dynamic shifting before them, and the little girl stood in the middle, her wide eyes darting between her parents. It was a scene that could have been pulled from a soap opera, filled with raw emotions and unresolved conflicts. "You should have thought of that before," the woman said sharply. "You don't get to just decide when you want to be a father. It doesn't work that way." Her words stung, and he could feel the weight of their shared history in her tone. They had been through so much together, and now it felt as though everything was unraveling in front of him. The officers remained silent, observing the escalating situation, their expressions unreadable. The man felt like he was in a spotlight, the weight of his past mistakes looming over him. He could feel the pressure building, both from the officers and from his ex-wife, and it was suffocating. "Look, we don't have to do this here," he said, attempting to defuse the situation. "Can we just talk about this somewhere else?" But she shook her head, her eyes blazing. "No, we're not going to just sweep this under the rug. Not after what you've done." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, the implication sending a chill down his spine. What did she mean by that? He had tried so hard to prove himself as a good father, to show that he could be trusted with their daughter. Yet here they were, standing in a public park, and all it took was a single call from a stranger to bring everything crashing down. The little girl tugged at her mother's arm, sensing the rising conflict. "Mommy, please don't be mad," she said, her voice small and vulnerable. "I just wanted to play with Daddy." The woman's expression softened for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened resolve. "This isn't about being mad, sweetie. This is about your safety." The man felt his heart drop. It was as if she had taken their daughter's innocent request and twisted it into a weapon against him. "I would never hurt her," he said, his voice rising slightly in desperation. "You know that." "I thought I did," she replied, her tone cutting through him like glass. "But things change. People change." Before he could respond, the officers intervened, attempting to bring the conversation back to the present. "We just need to establish a few things," one of the officers said, trying to regain control of the situation. "We need to know your relationship with the child." The man took a deep breath, feeling as if he was about to dive into deep waters. "I'm her father. We have joint custody. I was just trying to spend some time with her." The officer nodded, but there was a lingering doubt in his eyes. "Can you provide any documentation to prove that?" The man felt a surge of frustration, realizing that everything he had built, every moment he had fought for, could be stripped away in an instant by this misunderstanding. "I can get it for you," he said, his voice strained. "But can't we just—" "No." His ex-wife cut in, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You don't get to decide this, not anymore. You lost that right when you walked away." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and he staggered back for a moment, grappling with the emotional weight of her accusation. It felt like she had opened old wounds, wounds that had barely started to heal. He had tried to be there, to show he cared, but it was never enough in her eyes. Just then, the little girl interjected, her innocent voice rising above the fray. "Daddy, can I go play?" He looked down at her, seeing the confusion in her eyes. "Not right now, sweetie," he replied gently, fighting to keep his composure. "We need to sort this out first." But the moment he said it, he felt the weight of his words. The park was filled with children laughing and playing, and here they were, stuck in this awful confrontation. She didn't deserve this, and neither did he. His ex-wife turned back to officers, her expression resolute. "You need to understand that he's not a stable influence in our daughter's life. He has a history of—" The man's heart raced. He could feel the panic rising as he realized she was about to unveil parts of their past that he had fought hard to leave behind. "No," he interrupted, his voice breaking. "This isn't about that. This is about her, not us." But she pressed on, her voice rising with conviction. "I have every right to protect my daughter from someone who has let her down time and again." The officers exchanged another glance, and the man could feel their suspicions solidifying. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself, to show that he could be trusted, and now it felt like it was all unraveling. "Sir," one of the officers said, turning back to him, "is there anything you want to add to this?" He looked from the officers to his ex-wife and then down at his daughter, who stood watching, wide-eyed and confused. "All I want is to be a father," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I just want to spend time with her." But even as he said the words, he could see the doubt in his ex-wife's eyes, the skepticism that loomed between them like a chasm. It felt impossible to bridge. Then the tension broke when another car pulled up, this one a marked patrol unit, and the officer who had been radioing in his information stepped out. The arrival of additional law enforcement sent a ripple of concern through the gathered crowd. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked, taking in the scene with a practiced gaze. The first officer quickly briefed him, and the man felt his heart sink as he listened to his own story being recounted in front of him. "And the caller believes she witnessed something suspicious," the officer continued. The new officer turned to the man, his expression serious. "Can you tell me where you were before this?" The man opened his mouth to respond, but the words felt heavy and loaded. Every detail of his life suddenly felt scrutinized, as if he was standing trial for something he hadn't done. He thought of the park earlier that day, the laughter, the joy, the simple moments that felt so far away now. "Please," he said finally, his voice filled with desperation. "I was just taking my daughter to the park. I didn't think I needed to inform anyone." "You didn't think you needed to?" the officer echoed, an edge creeping into his tone. The man felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "No, I thought we could just enjoy a day together. I'm trying to be a father." His ex-wife shook her head, her eyes flashing with anger. "You don't get to use that excuse anymore." The new officer raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting back to the woman. "You're concerned for the child's safety?" She nodded, her expression fierce. "Absolutely. He has a history of erratic behavior. I'm just trying to keep our daughter safe." The words hung in the air, thick with tension, and the man felt his heart race again. This wasn't just about the park or an outing gone wrong. It was about every single moment they had spent together, the arguments, the mistrust, the fractures that had formed in their family. "How long have you been divorced?" the officer asked, his gaze narrowing on the woman. "Almost 2 years," she replied, her voice steady. "And what evidence do you have of your concerns?" The man held his breath, waiting for her to respond. He could see her hesitating, as if weighing her options. She knew that bringing up the past could be a double-edged sword, but she had always been one to fight with every weapon at her disposal. "The last time he had her, he didn't bring her home on time," she said, her voice laced with accusation. "I had to call the police." The man could feel the air drain from his lungs. That incident had been a misunderstanding, a simple error in judgment, but now it felt like a weapon turned against him. "I made a mistake," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. I was late. I didn't mean for it to happen. That's not good enough, his ex-wife shot back. That's the kind of thing that happens when someone isn't reliable. I can't just take your word for it. The officers exchanged another glance, and the man could see the doubt lingering in their eyes. It was the same doubt he felt every time he looked at himself in the mirror. He had tried so hard to be better, to be the father his daughter needed, but here they were, and nothing seemed to matter. You need to understand that we're just trying to protect her, the new officer said, turning back to him. We need to make sure she's safe. The little girl stepped closer to him, her small hand slipping into his. He looked down at her, seeing the trust in her eyes. Daddy, I'm scared, she said softly. He knelt down, wrapping an arm around her. It's okay, sweetie. They're just doing their job. But deep down, he could feel the panic rising. What if they decided he wasn't fit to be her father? What if this moment spiraled into something he couldn't control? The thought was unbearable, and he couldn't let that happen. Please, he pleaded, his voice cracking. I just want to be her father. That's all I've ever wanted. The officers looked at each other, and for a moment the world around them faded. The sounds of laughter and joy from the park became distant echoes, and all he could focus on was the warmth of his daughter's hand in his, the way she leaned against him for comfort. But just as he thought they might reach an understanding, a woman's voice broke through the tension, drawing everyone's attention. There you are. A figure emerged from the crowd, and the man's heart sank. It was the woman who had called the police, and he recognized her instantly. She was a neighbor, someone he had never spoken to but had seen around the neighborhood. What's going on here? She asked, her tone filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. The officers turned to her, and the man could see the uncertainty in their eyes. This wasn't just a situation that involved him anymore. It was spiraling out of control, and he could feel the stakes rising higher with each passing second. I saw him with that little girl, and I thought something was wrong, she explained, gesturing toward them. Why did you think that? One of the officers asked, his voice cautious. The woman hesitated, glancing at the man and his daughter. I just thought. It seemed strange. I didn't recognize him, and the little girl looked scared. The man felt a surge of anger at the woman's words. She didn't know him, didn't understand the bond he shared with his daughter, yet here she was, casting doubt on everything he had worked to build. You have to understand, he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. She's my daughter. We're just spending time together. But you're divorced, the woman pressed, her expression unwavering. Yes, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm her father, he insisted, his frustration boiling over. The officers listened closely, and he could see the gears turning in their minds. The situation had escalated beyond his control, and he knew that he had to do something before it slipped away completely. Look, he said, taking a deep breath. I understand your concern, but I swear to you, I would never hurt her. You're saying that now, but what proof do you have? The woman countered, crossing her arms defiantly. Proof, he echoed, disbelief coloring his voice. What do you want me to show you? A badge? A certificate? I'm her father, and that should be enough. But it's not, his ex-wife interjected, her tone biting. Not after everything. You've made promises before and broken them. The man felt the weight of her words crashing down on him again. It was as if he was fighting a battle on multiple fronts, and the enemy was closing in on him from all sides. He glanced down at his daughter, who was watching with wide eyes, her innocence hanging in the balance. You have to let me show you, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. Just give me a chance to prove it. The officers considered his words, their expressions serious. Finally, one of them nodded. Okay, we'll need to check your ID and any relevant documentation. Can you do that? He nodded, relief washing over him, but the moment was short-lived as he could see the skepticism lingering in their eyes. It felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, and any misstep could send him tumbling into the abyss. As he reached for his wallet, the little girl tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, I don't want you to go to jail," she whispered, fear etched on her tiny face. His heart ached at the thought. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetie. I promise," he reassured her, though he could feel the uncertainty gnawing at him. The officers watched closely as he pulled out his ID, handing it over with shaking hands. They examined it, their expressions inscrutable, and for a moment, silence enveloped them. Finally, one of the officers nodded, returning his ID. "Everything checks out," he said. "But we still need to ensure the child's safety." He felt a sense of victory at that moment, but it was fleeting. "What does that mean?" he asked, his heart racing. "It means we're going to have to question the child too," the officer replied. His stomach dropped. "You can't do that." "We have to," the officer insisted. "It's protocol. But she's just a little girl." "Exactly why we need to ensure she's safe," the officer replied firmly. The little girl clung to his side, her small hand gripping his tightly. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whispered again, her voice trembling. He knelt down to her level, forcing himself to stay calm. "It's okay, sweetie. Just be honest with them, okay? They're here to help." But the fear in her eyes told a different story, and he could feel his heart shattering at the thought of what she might say. Would she understand? Would she be able to separate the fear of the moment from the love they shared? As the officers prepared to question her, he could see the tension in the air building again. It felt as though everything was spiraling out of control, and the stakes had never been higher. He glanced back at the woman who had called the police, her expression now a mix of concern and curiosity. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, anger surging within him. "You think you're protecting her, but all you're doing is tearing our family apart." The woman shrugged, her eyes cold. "I'm just looking out for her. Someone has to." The man clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about their daughter, and every moment they spent in this park was pushing them further into uncertainty. As the officers guided the little girl away, he felt a sense of helplessness wash over him. He wanted to scream, to fight against the tide that threatened to pull him under. But deep down, he knew there was nothing he could do but watch as the walls closed in around him. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the park, and the laughter of children had faded into a distant echo. It felt like a cruel reminder of everything that had been lost, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long, difficult battle. He watched as the officers talked to his daughter, her small figure framed by the fading light. He wanted to call out to her, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air, and he could feel his heart racing as he faced an uncertain future. Would they believe him? Would they see the love he had for his daughter? Or would they only focus on the past? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more daunting than the last, and he realized that this was the moment that would define him. As he stood there, a father desperate to protect his child, the world around him blurred, and all he could think about was the bond they shared. He had fought for her, for their family, and he wasn't about to give up now. But as the darkness began to settle over the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. And in that moment, he realized that the real battle was just beginning. The woman who had called the police was watching him closely, her expression unreadable, and he could feel the tension between them crackling like electricity. What other secrets lay hidden in the shadows? What would happen when the truth finally came to light? He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The night was darkening, but he was determined to fight through the darkness. For his daughter, for their future, he would do whatever it took to protect the love they had built together. But just as he resolved to stand his ground, a chilling realization washed over him. The woman who had sparked this chaos wasn't just a bystander. She was part of something bigger, something he couldn't quite see yet. And as the stakes continued to rise, he felt a sense of dread settle in his stomach. What if she had a hidden agenda? What if she was working with someone else? Someone who wanted to tear his family apart? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, and he knew he had to uncover the truth before it was too late. The tension in the air grew thick as he prepared himself for the fight of his life. This was no longer just about being a father. It was about survival, about protecting everything he held dear. He could feel the pieces falling into place, and the shadows began to reveal themselves. The officers returned, their expressions serious, and he knew the time for talking was over. The stakes were higher than ever, and he had to act quickly. The clock was ticking, and he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. "Sir," one of the officers said, cutting through his thoughts, "we have some questions for you." He nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ask me anything. I'll do whatever it takes to prove I'm a good father." But as they began to question him, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and the truth would soon reveal itself. The shadows were closing in, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. As the night deepened, the park became a place of uncertainty, and he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. But within that uncertainty lay the flicker of hope, a hope that he would fight for, a hope that he would protect. The stage was set, and the real conflict was just beginning. As the officers began their questioning, the man felt a knot tightening in his stomach. They asked about his recent history, his work, and his relationship with his daughter. Each question felt like another weight pressing down on him, another layer of scrutiny that could crush him if he didn't tread carefully. He took a deep breath, focusing on the warmth of his daughter's small hand, still clutching his. That connection was his lifeline, and he couldn't let it slip away. "I've been working hard to improve my life," he began, trying to project confidence even as his voice trembled slightly. "I've been attending parenting classes and therapy sessions. I want to be a better father, to show her that I can be reliable." One of the officers nodded, but the skepticism in her eyes was unmistakable. "What about the accusations from your ex-wife? How do you respond to those concerns?" He glanced at his ex-wife, who was standing a few feet away, arms crossed and lips pursed. The look on her face was a mixture of defiance and worry. He wanted to shout at her, to tell her how unfair this all was, but instead he focused on the officers. "Those were misunderstandings. I've made mistakes, yes, but I've changed. I'm doing everything I can to be there for my daughter. Please, just ask her about our time together." The officers exchanged glances, and for a moment he hoped they might see the sincerity in his eyes. But doubt lingered in the air, thick like fog. "We will, but we have to ensure her safety first," one officer replied, gesturing for the little girl to come forward. "Daddy," she said, her voice quivering, "I don't want to talk to them. I want to go home." He knelt beside her, forcing a calm smile. "It's okay, sweetheart. They just want to know if you're safe with me. You can tell them the truth." He glanced at the officers, willing them to understand how delicate this moment was. "She just needs reassurance." The officer nodded, then leaned down to the girl's level. "Sweetheart, can you tell us how you feel when you're with your dad? Are you happy?" She looked at him, her big eyes glistening with uncertainty. "Yes," she whispered, then quickly added, "but sometimes I get scared when he's late." The words pierced his heart like a dagger. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. I'm working on it," he pleaded, desperation spilling into his tone. One of the officers jotted down notes, while the other continued asking questions. "Do you ever feel unsafe when you're with your father?" The little girl shook her head vigorously. "No, Daddy loves me. He always takes care of me." Relief washed over him, but the officers remained cautious. They turned to the ex-wife, seeking her perspective. "What do you think about that?" One of the officers asked her, his tone neutral. Her expression hardened. "She doesn't know what she's saying. He can be unpredictable." I can't let her be in that situation again. She's happy when she's with me, he countered, his voice rising slightly. You can't deny her feelings. The officer raised a hand to signal calm. We understand, but we need to consider all sides. Let's keep talking. As the conversation continued, tension mounted and the atmosphere became increasingly charged. The park, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground, and every word exchanged seemed to deepen the divide. Suddenly, the woman who had initially called the police stepped forward again, her expression intense. I can't just stand here and watch this unfold. I'm a teacher, and I see a lot of kids every day. If she feels threatened, that's my responsibility too. The man's heart raced. This stranger, who had come into their lives like a storm, was now an unexpected player in this high-stakes game. You don't know me, he said, struggling to contain his frustration. You have no idea what goes on in our lives. This is about my daughter, not your opinions. But she stood her ground. If there's a chance she might be in danger, I have to act. We have a responsibility to protect her. Her words echoed in his mind, resonating with his fears. Had he really changed? Had he done enough? In his heart, he knew he had tried, but would it ever be enough for everyone else? The officers, still processing the exchange, glanced at each other, their expressions serious. They had all the information they needed, but lacked a definitive answer. Finally, one of the officers turned back to him. We're going to need to take your daughter to a separate area for further questioning. It's just a formality. Panic surged within him. You can't take her away. She needs me. We're not taking her away permanently. This is standard procedure, the officer assured him. Standard procedure? He echoed, his voice rising again. Do you have any idea how much damage that could do? Do you think she'll understand? The officers remained firm, leading the little girl away. He felt his heart shatter as she looked back at him, confusion and fear etched on her face. Daddy, please, she cried. He couldn't move, couldn't speak as they escorted her toward the park's edge. It felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him, and all he could do was watch helplessly. As she disappeared from view, he felt a surge of fury rise within him, mixed with despair. How had it come to this? How had their lives been reduced to a moment in a park, with strangers making decisions about their family? He turned to his ex-wife, his anger boiling over. Look what you've done. You've pushed this too far. You're destroying our daughter's life. I'm protecting her. She shot back, her voice tinged with righteous indignation. Protecting her? Or protecting your own fears? You don't even give me a chance. The argument swirled around them, becoming a cacophony of accusations and hurt. The officers observed silently, their expressions carefully neutral. As the minutes dragged on, it felt like hours. He paced back and forth, unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the fragile thread that held their family together. Suddenly, the woman who had called the police stepped closer again, her gaze penetrating. Do you really care about your daughter? Or is this just about you not wanting to lose custody? Her words cut deeper than any knife. You don't know me, he said, voice thick with emotion. I would do anything for her. But would you? She pressed, her tone almost challenging.